On the morning of the 24th of August, 1969, on a burnt ridge above the Songchang Valley, 31 miles south of Da Nang, an American rifle company was handed a direct order, and it said no. Company A, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 21st Infantry, the Gimlets of the 196th Light Infantry Brigade. 5 days in the meat grinder, cut to half its strength. And when the order came down to move back into the valley where their friends had bled out, the exhausted men did the one thing the United States Army is built to make impossible. They sat down in the dirt. They looked their lieutenant in the eye, and they refused to move. By nightfall, the story was already racing across the wires toward the front page of the New York Times. Within 72 hours, one ugly word would be hanging over it in living rooms across America: mutiny. This is what actually happened on that ridge, not the headline, the truth. And the truth is smaller, stranger, and far more human than the myth that swallowed it. To understand why grown men would sit down under fire and dare their own army to punish them, you first have to understand the year, 1969. By that summer, the war was already lost at home. Walter Cronkite had said as much on the evening news. 500,000 Americans were in country, and the men humping the boonies knew something the generals would not say out loud. Nobody was going to win this. Every draftee arrived with a number burned into his brain. 365. That was the length of a tour in Vietnam. 365 days, and then you went home, if you were still breathing. The war was no longer about hills or valleys or flags. For the man on the ground, it had shrunk down to a single, brutal arithmetic. Stay alive, count the days, get on the freedom bird. And into that mindset, into a company of tired young men counting down their days, the Songchang Valley opened up like a grave. The Americans called it Death Valley. They had other names for it too. AK Valley, for the sound that came out of the tree lines. Antenna Valley. The Marines just called it the Arizona. Whatever you called it, the meaning was the same. It was a place that killed you. In August of 1969, the 2nd North Vietnamese Army Division moved into that valley in strength. Thousands of men, dug in deep. Not to hold ground, not to win a battle, to bleed the Americans white. A prisoner would later explain it plainly. Once his division was blocked from wiping out the little resettlement village at Hip Duk, the mission became simple. Inflict as many casualties as possible, then slip back into the mountains. They built for it. Bunkers roofed with logs and earth, trenches cut into the rice terraces, firing positions sited across open paddy so that a rifleman crossing that green, flat ground had nowhere on God's earth to hide. From the high ridges, North Vietnamese observers simply watched the Americans come. They waded through the bombs, they waded through the artillery, and when the infantry got close enough, they opened up. The trap was set weeks before Alpha Company ever walked into it. It started, as these things do, with contact. On the 12th of August, the North Vietnamese hit a firebase called LZ West, perched on a ridgeline 1,000 feet above the valley floor. Recon patrols started finding the enemy everywhere, well-fed, well-armed, and waiting. Then, on the 17th and 18th of August, a patrol from Delta Company, 4th Battalion, 31st Infantry, walked straight into a full North Vietnamese regiment near Route 534. The battle was on. The heat was its own enemy. Over 100 degrees, the air trapped and stale in the monsoon season, so thick a man could barely breathe it, let alone run in it. The wounded lay in the paddies and cooked. On the 20th of August, a young grenadier from Charlie Company of that same battalion took an AK round through the thigh and a grenade's worth of shrapnel through his foot in a rice paddy ambush near Hip Duk. His name was Rocky Blyer. A doctor told him he would never play football again. He would go on to win 4 Super Bowl rings with the Pittsburgh Steelers. But that is another story, from a different battalion. And on that day, he was just one more American bleeding into the mud of Death Valley. The valley took officers too. It did not care about rank. On the 19th of August, a Huey lifted off carrying Lieutenant Colonel Eli Howard, the battalion commander, and a freelance photographer named Oliver Noonan out shooting the war for the wire services. The North Vietnamese shot it out of the sky. All 8 men aboard were killed. The wreckage came to rest down in the valley, in ground the enemy still owned. And recovering those bodies, reaching that downed helicopter, became the mission that would grind Alpha Company down to nothing. Because Alpha was already a company running on empty before it ever reached the valley. Their trouble had started weeks earlier, and it had started stupidly, with a brawl, a fistfight with another company during a stand-down at Chu Lai. As punishment, the men were pulled off their rest and flown straight back into the field, into a hot landing zone. Worse, the men had lost their leader. Captain Dennis Chudoba was a West Pointer on his second tour. His men trusted him. They followed him because he had earned it in the only classroom that counts, under fire. And then he was gone, rotated out, and command of Alpha Company passed to a new man, First Lieutenant Eugene Schertz, Jr., 26 years old, an ROTC officer, decent and willing, but green, with barely 3 weeks in command of a company that was walking into the worst fighting of its life. An artillery observer who was there put it simply: they had lost a great leader, and after that there was no continuity. Now feed that company into the valley. Day after day, Alpha was ordered forward across the killing ground, toward the crash site, toward the bunkers. Day after day, the invisible enemy in the tree line let them come close, and then cut them down. For 5 straight days it went like that. The company would obey. The company would push. The company would get thrown back, leaving more men in the paddy each time. The squad leaders started dying. Then the platoon leaders. The men who held a rifle company together, the sergeants and lieutenants who tell 19-year-olds where to go and how to stay alive, were being killed and wounded faster than they could be replaced. By the 25th of August, the arithmetic had turned merciless. Alpha Company had gone into the valley near 100 strong. By the morning of the refusal, it was down to around 50 men still on their feet. 8 of their own were dead. The rest of the missing were bandaged, broken, or gone. Half the company, erased in 5 days. The survivors had not slept. They were out of water. There was no hot food, no mail, no relief. Their friends were dead in the elephant grass around them, and the men who remained were doing the grim math that every combat soldier eventually does. How much longer can this go on before it's me? And then the order came down. Move back into the valley, down the ridge, into the bunker complex where the enemy waited. Recover the dead. Lieutenant Schertz relayed the order to his men, and his men said no, not all of them at once. It started with a handful, 5 soldiers, draftees, 19 and 20 years old, who had simply reached the end of what a human being can give. They would not stand up. They would not walk back down into that valley. And the rest of the exhausted company did not force them. So Schertz did something no lieutenant ever wants to do.
He keyed his radio, and he called his battalion commander, and he told him the truth. On the other end was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bacon, Bobby Bacon, a West Point graduate on his second Vietnam tour. He had taken command of the battalion only days before, after the man before him was shot out of the sky. What passed between those two men over the radio that morning would be scribbled down, word for word, by an Associated Press photographer standing at the colonel's command post. Schertz's voice came over the net. "I am sorry, sir, but my men refuse to go. We cannot move out." There was a pause. Bacon: "Repeat that, please. Have you told them what it means to disobey orders under fire?" "I think they understand," Schertz answered, "but some of them have simply had enough. They are broken. There are boys here who have only 90 days left in Vietnam. They want to go home in one piece." And then the line that says everything about that war, in that year, at that hour. "The situation," the lieutenant said, "is psychic here." 90 days. That was the whole war, right there. Men close enough to the freedom bird to smell it, being asked to walk one more time into the exact ground that had killed half their friends. The photographer taking it all down was no stranger to combat. His name was Horst Foss. Beside him stood a reporter named Peter Arnett. Between them, those two men held 2 Pulitzer Prizes for covering this war. They knew a story when it landed in their laps, and this one had just landed. But out on that ridge, Bacon had a battle to run and dead men to recover. He was not going to lose his mind over 5 exhausted soldiers. He gave a cold, practical order. Leave the ones who won't move. Take the rest and get to the objective. Then he reached for the oldest tool in the Army's kit. He sent a hard man to fix it. Bacon dispatched his executive officer, Major Richard Waite, and one particular sergeant up the ridge to Alpha Company. The sergeant's name was Okie Blankenship, from Panther, West Virginia, a veteran of Korea and more of Vietnam than most men could stomach. He was not sent to sympathize. He was sent, in the plain words of the men who sent him,
to give them a pep talk and a kick in the tail. Blankenship climbed the ridge and found them. He found young men sitting in blackened, burned-off grass, uniforms caked stiff with dirt and dried blood. One of them was crying. These were not cowards. These were used-up boys who had given everything they had and been ordered to give more. A soldier yelled at him that the company had suffered too much, that it should not have to go on. Blankenship did not argue the point. He lied. He told them another company down in the valley was chewed down to 15 men, and it was still moving, still doing the job. Then he looked at the men of Alpha and said, with the contempt of an old soldier, that maybe those other men had something a little more than what Alpha had. That did it. A soldier came off the ground with his fists up, charging the sergeant, screaming the only thing left that mattered to him. "Don't call us cowards. We are not cowards." And that was the exact moment Blankenship had been fighting for, because he was right. They weren't cowards. They were proud men who had been pushed past the edge and needed a reason, any reason, to become soldiers again. Blankenship didn't say another word. He turned his back on them, and he started walking down the ridge, toward the valley, toward the guns. Behind him, one by one, the men of Alpha Company picked up their rifles, and they followed. From the radio call to the moment they moved out, the whole thing had lasted less than an hour. Now here is where the myth and the truth split apart for good. The world would come to believe that Alpha Company marched down into that valley and into a slaughter, that they had been right to refuse, that they walked into the meat grinder one final time. They didn't.
When Alpha reached the objective, the bunkers, the crash site, the ground they had dreaded, the enemy was gone. The 2nd North Vietnamese Army Division had done what it always did. It had bled the Americans, and then it had melted back into the mountains. The bunkers were empty. The trenches were silent. There was no last stand, no final massacre. The men who had refused to walk into a death trap walked instead into an empty, smoking valley, and they recovered their dead, and it was over. The great mutiny of Alpha Company ended not with a battle, but with silence. But 8,000 miles away, the story was just catching fire. Horst Foz and Peter Arnett filed what they had heard. And on the 26th of August, 1969, it ran on the front page of the New York Times. The headline, "Told to move again on 6th deadly day, Company A refuses." America read it over breakfast. A columnist called it a whiff of mutiny. The word spread faster than any correction ever could. An American infantry company, in the field, in combat, had refused a direct order. To a country already sick of the war, it looked like the army itself was coming apart at the seams. The army scrambled. The reporting was challenged almost immediately. Time magazine, digging into it, pointed out something the headline had buried. No reporter had actually been up on that ridge with Alpha Company. The claim that nearly the whole company had broken was, in Time's own word, exaggerated. It had been 5 men, for under an hour, in a company that then did its job. So what was it really? Colonel Bacon would insist for the rest of his life that it was never a mutiny at all. His argument was uncomfortable and precise. The men, he believed, were never given a clean, direct, formal order until the battalion stepped in, and the instant they were given one and led, they moved. Every one of them. The soldiers themselves said the same. One private, writing home to Maine, begged people to understand. This company was not chicken. They had lost half their number in 5 days of fighting. There was no mutiny, he said, and to call it one was a disgrace. Another put it flatly. They never once said they would not go down the hill. The moment the lieutenant gave them a direct order, they started moving. The truth was quieter than the headline, and heavier. This was not a rebellion. It was the sound a unit makes when it has been pushed exactly one step past what men can bear, and then, because of one hard sergeant and a lie about another company, takes that step anyway. As for the man in the middle of it, Lieutenant Eugene Schurz, the Army handled him quietly. No court-martial, no prison. 2 days later, he was moved to a desk job at battalion headquarters, and an experienced captain was brought in to run Alpha Company. Bacon's judgment of him was not cruel. Schurz's mistake, he felt, was that he tried to reason with exhausted men when the moment called for a boot in the tail. "Give him a few more months as a platoon leader first," the colonel said, and the young man would have gone a long way. He simply had not been ready. Almost no one is, at 26, with 3 weeks in command, in a valley called death. And here is the part the headline never captured. Alpha Company was not alone. Not in that year. By 1969,
the machine was grinding down. In 1968, the Army recorded 68 combat refusals across all of Vietnam. In the years that followed, the numbers climbed, and so did something darker: the murder of officers by their own men, a horror the troops gave a name: fragging. The refusals, the fragging, the drugs, the countdown calendars, they were all symptoms of the same disease. An army of draftees, in a war their own country had stopped believing in, being asked to die on the back nine of a losing game. The men of Alpha Company were not radicals. They were not cowards.
They were tired, grieving, terrified young men who for less than 1 hour on one ridge could not take another step, and who then took it anyway. That is the thing worth remembering. Not that they refused, that they went. Every soldier who has ever been afraid understands the first part. The refusal is easy to imagine. What is hard, what is almost beyond imagining, is standing back up after you have already decided you can't, and walking down the hill toward the guns, because a man you respect walked first. Courage is not the absence of that moment on the ground in the burned grass. Courage is what Alpha Company did next. If you found this story worth your time, YouTube thinks there's another one you're going to want to see next. It's already waiting for you right there on your screen. Go ahead and give it a watch.